So here we are on a new edition of Words with Friends. And today I have my friend Mike Ganino. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up? Thanks for having me.
It's good to be here. And the word we're talking about today is the word culture. So Mike, tell me what culture means to you.
Culture means to me is, whether we're talking about work or we're talking about, a friend group or a school or just anytime people get together or the world, because we're a big culture and a bunch of small cultures. It's ultimately like the collective story of a group of people. So what are the stories we tell about the right way to do things? What are the stories we tell about, showing up places, about what to wear? And all of those collective stories over time start to create a group identity. And that group identity kind of lays out the plays we do. So it's the condition, it's the way in which we kind of move through the world.
Okay. So why does culture, though, create almost like a barrier around it? Some people feel like I don't fit within that culture. That's not me. Why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, this is like an interesting thing, right? Because there's this idea of, like culture shock when we travel, and you and I both get to go so many cool places, but there's culture shock. You go to Italy for the first time and you think like, I've got this coffee thing down. I know how to do coffee. And then the first time you walk into an Italian coffee bar, you're like, this is different. Like they're all just kind of shoving their way to the counter and they yell something and they drink it really quick and nobody's getting to-go cups. And I know that I'm having coffee, but something's different here. And it's because the stories that we've written or the expectations we have around how to get coffee are different than the world we're going into. Well, that same thing happens with groups, whether we're talking about like a group of high school, Mean Girls, the movie Mean Girls, the musical now, or we're talking about like a group of people at work, or we're talking about, even just groups within a country and where they live. The stories are what we use to like connect with each other, I think. And when you and I have a similar one and it's like, oh yeah, we're these kind of guys and we have these shared experiences, it's easy for other people, one, to say, I don't fit in with them because I don't have those shared experiences. And it's easy for us to be like, oh, they're different than us. And I think that's natural. Like we didn't exist in these huge groups that we are in now. And so I think, if we go like way back, like speaking of evolution, we're like used to being in these small tribes of people and we had to have like something that bonded us. And I don't know, I think that's the origin of us versus them. And sometimes culture can be a tool that people use to kind of maintain that.
Okay. Now, historically, those cultures would have been almost quite clearly defined, right? So what would have happened is that, I'm going to Italy, coffee is different here. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now here, say in the United States of America or in much of the westernized world, cultures are embedded, they're interwoven, they are clearly overlapping, etc. Yet still these stories exist. So how do people perhaps behave better when they find themselves in a culture that's foreign to them? Or how do people better accept looking into somebody else's culture where it feels uncomfortable and start to be able to embrace that? What's your take on that?
I think for me, like with the travel thing specifically, and I think it's useful in all kinds of situations, it's being able to look for the things that are the same. And so sure, maybe we don't get coffee the same, but is there something that's the same? And one, to be able to embrace, I mean, I teach a lot of improv, like theater improv tricks in my little bag of tricks we use. Some of them are improv to help people learn to say yes and to each other and to learn to say yes and to the experiences they're having, to kind of say, okay, well, this is happening. What can I do with it? And I think that same idea when we do find ourselves in new cultures, whether it's traveling or getting a new job or going to a new school or moving across town or going to a new grocery store. Like even going to a new grocery store can be a little bit of a culture shock sometimes. I remember the first time I went to Whole Foods a long time ago, I thought, wow, this is like both, like whether you're very wealthy or you're very, kind of poor on the other end, like people at those two things have very specific, and this is me at 22, so maybe I don't feel this way at 38, but it was like, oh, these rich people at Whole Foods are pretty weird. Like, this is a weird group of people because it was totally new to me, It's like someone like spritzing you with patchouli oil as you walk down the aisle. Like to me, that was a new thing. And so you can either be scared of it and you can say, oh no, this isn't happening, this isn't right. Or you can accept the fact to say, oh, you know what? There isn't one right way to do whatever, coffee or grocery shopping in this case. Or if you're at work, there's not a right way to do meetings necessarily. And so what would happen if I just kind of sank into this and figured out what works about it, what's interesting about it, and can I add this experience to kind of my patina as a person? And so I think my recommendation for travel specifically, and really anytime you're kind of plopped down in the middle of culture, even for us, you know, like you live in New York, I live in LA. If either one of us got a gig with like Walmart and we had to go to the middle of the country here, that's new experience for us. And we can either say, whoa, what are these people all about here? What are they doing? They're so weird, nod. Or we could say, oh, this is just a different vibe. And what can I pull from this? What can I learn from this?
Yeah, and I think that's so true, right? This belief of, okay, this culture is different. They have a different story to what I'm used to. I love that piece of advice of almost just play into it, just lean into it, see what you can learn and see where you can find common threads. And chances are something that is currently crazy scary to you, all of a sudden you're like, we're not all so different across the board. And we see this politically speaking now. We see this with, you know, we're doing this interview and we're kind of right in the time of Pride, right? And those things are all kicking up, and people have strong beliefs about overlaps in culture between political persuasion, sexual persuasion, race, creed, those kind of things. I'm listening to what you're saying here right now about lean in and look to be able to understand and find commonality. And I'm thinking that would be applicable everywhere. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, and again, like a very micro level, even just you go to a new city, not even internationally, you're just like traveling around and you go to a new place and it's like, oh, where do they grocery shop? How do they drive? How do they park? What are they all about? All the way up to what you're saying, like these very core beliefs that people carry around, you know, this, like you said, this month with sexual orientation and what we believe there. It's very hard to, you know, there's some quote, I don't know who said it, someone really famous, but I don't remember who. It's very hard to hate close up, you know?
Okay, love that.
And so if you're traveling, if you're in Italy or whatever, like just get closer to it, like go closer to it and experience it. And what you can often find is there's a lot more that's the same about us than is different. And that works regardless of whether we're talking about travel, about political beliefs, about social beliefs, or about work. You know, like it doesn't matter what it is. It's hard to hate close up.
I remember that real specific actually from a trip. First time I went to Bangkok in Thailand, and I got off the plane and went walking out for like an hour or so with my wife Charlotte, and I hated it. It was horrible. It was dirty. Like people were everywhere. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. I woke up the next day, walked into the exact same environment with a completely different view about it. And 2 hours later, I'm like, this is cool. Weird, but I love it. It was like a complete different thing, but it was the same. And it was all about the lens that I chose to be able to look at it through.
You had to like sleep off your city thoughts.
I think I would have hated everything at the moment. Like on reflection, looking back on it, I was just tired.
Yeah.
But we're all allowed to do that. You're spending a huge amount of your expertise now working with companies in the area of corporate culture, business culture. Mm-hmm. Whenever I speak to somebody who's left the job, the typical response I get from all of the people I've interviewed through the years has been, well, it just didn't feel right. I didn't kind of fit. What are some of the kind of commonalities that you've seen through your world about getting that fit and feel right within a corporate organization?
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is it's very few people. I mean, there are some people who, you know, they moved or they went off to have children or some other reason. They had some interesting opportunity. But most of the time, the reason people leave is, you know, something related to culture. The managers didn't listen, or this didn't happen, or it wasn't an environment that was positive or something like that. Or like you said, I just didn't fit. Those are over and over and over. That's what I hear. And I think two things happen. One is that a lot of organizations really, you know, somewhere along the way, somebody said you should pay attention to culture fit.
Yeah.
And so it started to look like this robotic group of people who all were the same. It was this very like homogeneous group of people. And I think that's part of like the problem that we've seen in the Silicon Valley. I think it's part of the problem that we've seen at the top levels of the entertainment industry, where we just continue to bring people in who were cultural fits, which meant they sounded and looked like us. I always think, and I think that cultural fit is a very easy way to slip into unconscious bias and sometimes even conscious bias of like, well, if you don't like playing rugby every day and getting drunk, then you're not a cultural fit.
Yeah.
Same thing. And so I think a lot of places did that. And so if you're somebody new, if somebody comes along and says, hey, we should start bringing different types of people into the org. Well, if you're one person in a group of 100 or 1,000 people who is different because someone decided finally, let's bring in some diversity here. then of course you don't feel like you fit, because you actually do not fit.
Right.
And then the other thing I see, and that's related to kind of what you said about somebody saying, it wasn't a good fit for me, is that organizations kind of make decisions in certain ways. They communicate in certain ways. They share ideas in certain ways. And it's really important in the interviewing process to figure out, is the way you do this the way we do? And, you know, a lot of times when we think of company culture, people think they're trying to go for this specific one. Like, we all need to look like Google, or we all need to look like this company. But the reality is, like, any corporate culture can be good as long as you're clear about it. Like, if you want to have a super stuffy, like, banking environment, and we're very formal and we're very serious, that's totally okay. But you need to hire to that. You need to teach to that. You need to lead to that. It's when there's those inconsistencies. And the scenario you said is often one I see where people, they don't feel like they fit anymore. And it's largely because it's so inconsistent that they don't even know what's expected of them.
So the inconsistency is the issue. And I guess if you take a scientific view on culture, you're talking about like a petri dish with cells in it that is growing out in a certain kind of way. And you've got some things that grow and do good, right? And then you've got something that grow that go on to be able to kill a generation of people.
Yeah.
So the term itself could run in either direction.
Yeah.
How do I create a good culture then? If what I have is, I'm a company owner, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a leader within a large organization, and I decide today I want to take steps towards creating a good culture, how do I go about it?
Yeah, I think the first thing, one, is to, you know, so I have this belief that experiences that we have as people, experiences create stories. That's it. Like, you know, your story of going to Bangkok, that is probably a story you've told many times. It's some experience you had there.
No, but yeah, you just drew it out on me, but it's lived in me for a while for sure.
Well, good. We got to get it out. There's probably some good stuff that happened there. So experiences are what we go and tell stories over. And so those stories, when they start to be collected and shared and they become part of like the collective conscious of a group of people, that becomes culture. So there's this very clear through line for me of experiences we have become stories we tell. As we share those stories and more of us have the same story, then we end up with this culture. And so if you want to understand, like, well, how do I have a good culture? I don't think it's possible to sit down and say, let's draft a culture. Like, let's sit down with the blueprint and what are the ingredients? It's not like baking, you know, it's like, what are the ingredients of this? It's a little bit more like, I've always wanted to do this, like this cooking show called Improv Kitchen. Cause I'm married to a chef who's like super genius at like whatever, like I can go to the fridge and there's like, I don't see anything. It's like, there's nothing to make. We got some baking soda and some, you know, lychee to make a martini, and that's it. It sounds like I'm like living in a bachelor pad, or a frat house. And he'll come along and he can find, like, immediately be like, oh, here we go. And it's like some 5-star meal, you know, some amazing meal. And I didn't even see anything there. So I've always wanted to do this thing called Improv Kitchen. I think that if a company is watching this, if somebody's watching this and says, oh, I want to think about culture, it's more like Improv Kitchen and a little less like a Martha Stewart baking show. Okay. You don't get to go to the cabinet and choose all the right ingredients and put them together and end up with some beautiful, you know, Martha Stewart level dish. What you have to do is go to the kitchen and figure out what's in this kitchen. Let me go explore what's here, and let's figure out what's working, and where there's dysfunction in our culture, let's figure out what are the experiences that are leading people to have a certain kind of story that's being told collectively. And now let's go change those experiences, because it'll shift the story. Then the stories, once they shift, will lead us to a new culture. It's like if you and I go on a trip, and it's like we've both been to, you know, say Des Moines. It's always hard because you say a city and then someone from there watches and then they're like, I hate what you said about us. But
you were about to say Des Moines, Iowa.
So I was about to say that. I went to college in Des Moines, Iowa, so I feel like it's fair game. If we were both like to say, and we had some bad experience, and then we met another friend of ours and they had a bad experience, well, great. Now we all start talking about it, and everyone else who's never been there starts to say, ooh, don't go to Des Moines.
That's so true. I get it even here in New York, where people are like, I've been to New York, I didn't like it. I'm like, where did you go? Well, I was in Times Square for 24 hours.
Right.
A layover on my way back from San Francisco to get back to the UK. And and you're like, oh, so that's your whole experience of New York. No wonder you don't like it, right? Okay. No, I see that. I love this thought of collective consciousness. That is huge. I see a giant challenge with it. Now, I do a lot of work with small independent businesses that have often gone through a lot of growth. So they started as a one-man band, became a two-man band, became 4 people in an organization, became 7 people in an organization. Everything's beautiful collective conscious, all these stories grow layered on top of each other. People had time for each other. People cared for each other. Then 7 becomes 15 after 7 years, and it gets lost.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's because they don't take the time to, A, give people the edited highlights of the collective consciousness that got them from A to E, and then didn't sit down and say, hey, it's now time to write some new stories to get us from E to H or whatever.
Yeah.
In the alphabet. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, it's twofold. It's the example you gave is so common, by the way. Some people don't realize it until they get to 10,000 employees. And it's like, well, wait a second. We all knew what was going on when we were in the garage. And it's like, it's been a long time since the garage, my friend. And so that's so common that we went from 1 to 2 to 7. And it's so easy when you're in the same room, like all of the energy from the founder and the few founding people, that's all you need to get by in the beginning, because every experience is them. So I'm having an experience with, if you founded a company and I was working in it and we're just working, 7 of us in your house or something, then I'm having experiences with you all the time that are telling me the story of who we are, which creates that culture. As it goes on, I'm having less of those experiences. So my stories start to become different types of stories. There's still a culture being created. It's just different than it was before, because we're not actively creating experiences that are in the interest of a specific story. And so what I find often is that, and this is the thing, I'm gonna preach a little on story, because I've said it a lot here. One of the things that's happening in the world right now is the word story became so popular. I blame the moth for it, but everybody and their grandmother is talking about and teaching storytelling. And often it is used in a way that is about, how do I as a brand tell a story that consumers will be interested in? And that's great, wonderful, sure, that's important, and we should be doing that. It's a great way to communicate. But I think there's something really interesting about listening to the stories inside of your company. So not saying, oh my God, we're 50 employees, I as the founder need to come up with a new story to tell everybody. I think it's more going in and listening to the stories that they're telling and saying, okay, well, what does that mean then? Because again, this isn't Martha Stewart, this is Improv Kitchen. So you've got to go in the kitchen and say, what's in this kitchen? Like, you got to open up and say, what's in the bottom and the back of that fridge? What's the story people are telling about that? What is the story people tell about their first week here, their first day here, their interview process here, about how decisions are made here? And so often when I go and work with a group like you're talking about, if I went in with somebody who, had 30 or 40 clients, you said, hey, I'm working with this group, they need some culture help. That's where I'd start, is not asking the CEO, what story do you want people to know? I'm going to go listen to the stories inside of the company and say, well, here's what they're saying. What here works and what here do we need to shift? Okay.
So what you're saying is, instead of having a 6-year-old opinion on the story being told, saying, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to soak it in, I'm going to believe the fairy tale, you're saying, let's take an adult view on the story and let's go question the story and have a little more curiosity fueling your listening, and go looking for the truth in the story rather than the fable in the story.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, exactly. Got it. Love that. Okay. So what about mission statements and values and slogans and all of that kind of jazz? What's Mike's take on that?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's helpful if it's helpful. So if I go into a group and, again, let's say you send me someone over, I go to work with them, they've got 100 employees, they've grown from 2 employees to 100 in 2 years. And they say, okay, we've got all this stuff going on. So we start to cultivate the stories so we can understand what experiences have led to those stories, that are ultimately impacting culture. The thing that happens sometimes is people pull out their little book, their little handbook, and they say, but look, they're not doing what the mission says. So I understand that story the employee is telling, but that's not our mission, or that's not our vision, or those aren't our values. And what I always say is, all of those things are great and wonderful as long as they're true. Right. It's like if you read one of the fairy tales that you're talking about, and it said in the fairy tale, like, well, the moral of the story is that you've got to wake up early to get the worm. The early bird gets the worm. But then everyone in the story who was winning was not the early bird, it was the late bird, and they kept winning. Eventually the culture in the group's going to say, well, that stuff in the book about early bird gets the worm is total BS. So don't do that anymore. They lie to you. And that's what I see happen in so many companies. They say, we value really clear and candid and caring conversation, and yet everyone is being passive aggressive and unclear with each other and holding back. And so eventually that experience is going to change the story, which is going to change the culture. And so mission, vision, and values have a total place in it. In the book, I write about those things because I think I would probably be like thrown into like the culture volcano fire pit if I didn't include them, because it's kind of a standard thing. But I think there's a different way to approach it. And the way to approach it is to say, how do we use those things to work together differently?
Right. How do we use them to work together differently? I like that. And there's an example that always jumps to mind. And as a kid, when I was studying business studies, like at school, etc., we kind of got deep into this mission and purpose, etc. And we were tasked with the challenge of going to look out to big brands and find their mission statements and find the ones that you adore. And one that I used to adore, I won't say the company, I'll just see if anybody knows it, is Lovell Serval. And then I got to experience many of that brand's experience on my travels and realized it isn't true through my lens. And it created this giant contradiction that it went from being an organization that I had admiration towards, sitting within a space and having a belief around the way those employees would carry themselves, to being like, it's a load of BS.
Yeah.
You know, it's a front. Like there's no truth there, etc. So I guess if this is incongruent, that's where we can decide to exit a culture. We can say, I don't want to be a part of this because it doesn't feel true to me.
Right. Well, and it's probably the example that you asked before of, you know, you've run into so many people who say, oh, I left because it wasn't a good fit for me. I'd imagine that the espoused values, or like the first week or the interview, it was a fit. What happened was that values gap between what was said and what reality was, that is where the person in your example said, ooh, that's not a fit for me, because they wouldn't have made the decision to join it if it didn't sound great originally.
So what I'm learning here is that the enemy of culture is incongruence.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah. Because even if you want to have a culture that's super, I mean, we can look at so many companies and say, well, working at Pixar is very different than working at Apple, who, by the way, at some point shared Steve Jobs, but that is a very different experience, those two places. And is either one right or wrong? I don't know. I don't tell anybody that there's a specific type of culture we should all have, except for an honest one that is about communication. I think regardless of whether you want a formal culture, an intense culture, a laid back culture, whatever it is that you want, do it clearly and have lots of communication in it. And so the challenge is when we're unclear or we're unspecific or we're inconsistent, because then people don't know how to, it's like if you and I were, again, if we were traveling and it's, you know, think about the times when you go to the airport, and this is such a stupid like thing that people like you and me say of like, you know, I was traveling and this happened, but when you go to the TSA and all of a sudden it's a completely new set of rules and it's like, wait, why does this matter in Des Moines, but it doesn't matter?
I hate that, because what they do is they look at you like you should know. And I'm like, I go through way more airports than I believe you've ever done.
Right.
And this is different to what you said yesterday. Like belt on, belt off, jacket on, jacket off, laptop in, laptop out. What do you want with my toilet? I'm confused.
Right. And so now imagine that happening inside of a work where you're going every day. And now people are saying, you know what? And this is, I think, you know, we've been studying this whole like engagement thing for 20 years, and it's not moved the needle at all. All of these things we've done, whether ping pong tables, stock options, snacks, retreats, trust falls, it has not moved the needle on engagement and happiness at work. And I think the problem is because we're not dealing with that enough, which is to say, I'm disengaged because I just don't know how to live in this world. Because like one day we do this, the next day we don't. Sometimes it matters. We talk about respecting each other's time. This happened recently. We talk about respecting each other's time. And then I was watching in this organization, it was like every single manager was 10 to 15 minutes late to a meeting. And it was like, well, if you're going to say that that's super important, then now that as an employee, I'm confused, you know? And I think that's where disengagement comes from, because it's easier to check out than to constantly feel like you and I at the TSA, like, what's the rule today, friends? That's a hard thing to live with every day in your 9-to-5 job.
It's hugely difficult. And what I'm like, before challenging you today, like, I could have easily seen that culture is like this fluffy little thing that we do on Thursdays. But what I'm seeing here is that culture played right leads to certainty of the people that were within that culture. That certainty leads to trust. That trust goes towards less friction, more accountability, more momentum. The long and the short of it is it's probably the biggest single ingredient towards productivity, which is probably the single biggest factor towards profitability, which is largely what most people are in business for, is some form of success, regardless of how you choose to measure it. Yet the one thing that fuels all of this is the environment of which is created, and that environment is set via culture.
Yeah.
So
100%.
This is probably a pretty darn important thing. There are leaders in their home life, leaders in business, leaders in giant corporations that at this moment in time are 100% certain that there is a problem within their culture.
Yeah.
And doing nothing about it other than confirming the certainty that they know they have a problem with their culture in their own mind. And I think this is a scary place for people to be in, is regardless of where your life is if you're feeling like there's some incongruence and some stuff that doesn't fit here, how do you act on that? What are your first steps to? Because it looks like the biggest elephant that you could possibly try and eat.
Yeah.
Where do you start?
I think there's two places to start. I think the very first one is to say, and this is something I see happening all the time, you know, when I'll talk to someone about culture or talk about the work environment, is it's always relegated to be the job of like a person or a team of people in HR. And that is wrong. That should not be, it's impossible for them to do that. They're not in every meeting. They're not in every conversation. It is a huge mistake. So when I run into leaders, executive CEOs who say, oh yeah, culture, great, we'll send our HR person. I know, good luck.
Chief Culture Officer.
Yeah, that can't be where it lives. Now, those people can be in charge of finding programs and measuring stuff, but they can't be in charge of the culture because that's just not the reality of it. So that's the number one mistake. The thing I think that people have to do at all levels is really rethink their beliefs. And this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning around what should it be like when you arrive in Bangkok for travel? What is it like when you get to Italy for coffee, or Bentonville to go to Walmart? What do I believe about that? And the way that this presents itself almost all the time to me is when I run into leaders who say, employees today, and then fill in the blank with whatever you want, are entitled, lazy, there's no good talent today, all of those things. And I always say, well, that's a belief. That's a story you told yourself. So sure, you had some experience that led you to that story that has created this culture where now you can't hire anyone because you believe everyone's stupid. So right. What if you change that belief? And I asked this question. There's this woman that's kind of like a self-helpy lady named Byron Katie who has a program called The Work. And the first question of it is that true? And it's really funny when I ask leaders that and they say, well, there's no good people today. And I say, oh, wow. So let's shut up, close the windows, lock the doors. Like, you're in trouble if that's true. So is it true? And it's often not true. It's a story they've told themselves and they keep playing it. So the first thing I always have people do is go in and say, what beliefs do you have that are blocking your success? And almost always there's stuff there.
Okay. I love that. Great question. What beliefs do you have that's blocking your success? Okay.
And it's hard sometimes. You sometimes need someone else because it's hard to evaluate yourself like that unless you've been through like a lot of psychotherapy. It can be hard to do that. And so because of your beliefs, it's what you think is true, but they're changeable. And
it's the collective you're though, isn't it? It's like what beliefs are blocking your success, not your success, right?
Yeah.
Individual you're, it's the collective you're.
Totally.
Okay. This is really freaking interesting. I like this chat. This is why I have words with friends. I know that you could chat on this stuff forever, but I got time for 3 more questions.
Great.
First of those questions is, if you had something you wanted to ask me to be able to flip the interview around in some way, relate back towards the word of culture in some way, what might that question be?
You know what I'm interested in? This is something I see a lot, and so I want to get your take on it. What do you see that leads to a healthy sales culture? Because I've seen so many teams, and in a lot of organizations, this is their largest team of people is the sales team. And I've seen it go so wrong so often. I've seen it become a really unhealthy place. And, you know, whether that's blamed on extrinsic motivation from these commission plans or it's based on some cutthroat thing. I'm curious, what do you think are the ingredients of a healthy sales culture?
2 things. One is collectively moving the finish line. Mm-hmm. The finish line isn't the day that you close the sale, secure the contract, win the purchase order, bank the check. The collective agreement needs to be the finish line is when the other person receives a return on the promise that was made for them at the point of transaction. Now, if everybody believes that and then plays towards that new finish line, then the closing of the sale is a step in the journey. It's not the day that we should all celebrate, which goes against much of what people see romanticized around the sales culture. Like the romantic version, movie version of great sales culture is Glengarry Glen Ross, or it's Wolf of Wall Street. Let's get the team on a private jet clinking champagne flutes and popping pills. Like, that's not a great sales culture. That says we just robbed people and we're happy about it. Well, so moving the finish line is a big thing. And then the second part of that is to understand that sales is a philosophy. It's not a department. You know, we all need to be on the same page. And there are two departments in every business as I see it. One is the sales department and the other is the sales support department. And I think if everybody can understand that that's what their job is, what now happens is everybody in an admin, management, HR, leadership role understands that what they're there is to support the sales force, which is the lifeblood of the organization. And the sales force believe that what they're there to be able to do is to make promises that can be exceeded by the other operational stuff within the business. Then we create a culture that is one team. So that would be my take in terms of what I see. And when you see an organization that's truly winning, it's when those things are in sync.
I love that. I love the first thing you said too, of there's got to be something in an organization that is, you know, providing some kind of client service or client product, and saying, instead of the closed date as the EA salesperson run off, it's the client is happy and using the service date or the launch date or something. Because I imagine if there's other people in the company who are responsible for that target, now it brings everybody closer. If there's an accounts management team who's responsible for launching an account, now they're on the same page.
The example I use best is if you're in the business of selling wedding dresses. Now, if you're in the business of selling wedding dresses, the most important day is not the day you sell the dress. You know, there are 6, 7, 8, 9 checkpoints that happen after the day that you've agreed to be able to sell the dress that are way more important than the day you sell it, with the most important day being, how does that product perform on the day itself? So if you understand the finish line is, how does that dress perform on the day? It doesn't matter how good they felt about it in the dressing room. It doesn't matter how good you did the alterations. It doesn't matter whether everybody loved it. If the bride doesn't love it on the day and it doesn't do the job that was asked on the day of the wedding, guess what? You failed.
Yeah, I love that.
So I think that's a simple example that every organization should look towards, is to think like they are selling wedding dresses and see how that might play out differently. Another question is one that I ask everybody on Words with Friends. And in season 2, it's a new question, so nobody knows what the question is. And the question I have for you today is, if there was a single word, an adjective used to describe you that you overheard from strangers talking about you, what would that word be in your idealistic opinion?
Yeah. I will say I think pragmatic. I hear pragmatic a lot. Like, the two things that come up a lot when I ask people, like, hey, why'd you refer me to those people? I'm always curious, like, what did you say? What were the words you used? And energy is one of them. And the other is pragmatic, that like these ideas, like even culture can be so fluffy.
Yep.
And, I try to make it like super practical. Like, what can you actually do? It's not just about like a feeling or a vibe and, you know, put up enough plants in the office and it'll get there. I try to give really specific, clear advice so people can go take action so they don't feel lost. So I would say pragmatic. That gets me excited.
Okay. I like that. That's a cool word, and one that I didn't really understand what it meant up until right now. So that's cool. And final question is Mike, what are you all about? Where can we find out more about you? Where do people come if they want to learn more about all the things that make you awesome?
Yeah, cool. I'm easy to find. I'm Mike Ganino everywhere. I'm typically the Mike Ganino if you type that in, that you will find. So Mike Ganino in all the social places, and MikeGanino.com is where you can find all the other details. And, you know, when you go there, what you're going to find is super simple, pragmatic ideas around how to change the way we show up and work together so we can get all the stuff we want, like what you said, which is ultimately productivity, whether that's for our careers or ourselves, or our businesses, we want to be more productive and have higher levels of performance. And I believe that comes through the way we communicate so we can have the cultures that inspire us to do great stuff.
Awesome. Mike, thanks for chatting culture with me today. And thank you for being the most pragmatic guest that we've had on World.
Thanks, buddy.